We have designed this last session of the day so that it's very interactive. We want to get input and feedback from all of you in the audience, because in many ways this is kind of the hottest and most complex of the many topics that we've raised here at this event so far. You know, the central premise of what we're trying to focus on here at Brainstorm Design is this idea that design has unusual, sort of extraordinary power. And I think all the presentations that we've heard from over the last 2 days has helped us to see the many facets of that thesis. But power obviously can be used for good, or it can be used for evil. And I think that what we're discovering as we learn how to use design and design skills and design thinking is that the temptations to use it subversively are many. And so that's what we want to talk about here today. And John and Jamie are really ideal people to give us some insight into that. John, you've written a book called Design for Good, obviously, and thought a lot about these issues. You've been doing some work with a group of companies to come up with a designer's pledge. It's called the Vanguard Group. Tell us a little bit about that and how that conversation came about.
You bet, Clay. Thank you. Last year at this time, just a couple weeks after the last Brainstorm Design, a group of us, including Tim Brown, Jocelyn Wyatt from IDEO.org, and Joe Gebbia from Airbnb, inaugurated a group called the Design Vanguard. And the goal was to bring together senior design and creative leaders from an array of companies to talk about the intersection between design, philanthropy, and social change. 3 things that are often discussed separately. And we gathered at the Eames Ranch in Northern California and had a really provocative conversation. But one of the most interesting things is that the top people from this array of companies all were looking for guidance around the ethical implications of design. And there was the phrase that bubbled up both here in Singapore at that time last year, as well as at our event, around the unintended consequences of design. And so folks had called on us to develop a kind of manifesto or code of ethics. And we decided to opt for something that we're calling the Designer's Pledge, which I'm happy to share a little bit about with you today.
Great. Do we have a couple of slides from the Designer's Pledge that we can
So this is just a sense of the companies that are involved. We have big and small companies, legacy companies, startups, and this is just a small sample of them. We have about 50 people currently that are active participants in this community. It's been largely under the radar. But if you go to the next couple of slides, we decided to kind of crowdsource this Designer's Pledge. And if you go to the next one, this is one of, I'm going to share just really 3 of the 10 stanzas from the pledge. This one is talking about treating design as a shared endeavor. And so it's about collaborating and co-creating with communities, with underrepresented voices, and really using design as a chance to amplify those voices. This is not rocket science. This is just like reflecting back some of the basic things that we all need to do as we're designing and creating the kind of change we want to create in the world. So the next one. The next is kind of an outgrowth of that language around unintended consequences of design. It's to basically say that those things may happen, but our responsibility is to remedy them when they do arise. And so how, as designers, do we prepare for responding in a very proactive way to things as conflicts as they do arise? And the final one that I'll share today is really just to talk about the power, the transformative power of design. It is about the glory of the possible. This is not all just about like do this and don't do this. It's really to remember what attracted so many of us to design in the first place. And so we'll be sharing this pledge more publicly later this month. We'll be bringing the Design Vanguard to light through a web presence and future events. But I really appreciate the chance to share a little bit about it today.
This is really important, I think. And I just personally feel that having these kind of guideposts for people and having everyone engaged in a mutual conversation about that makes it much easier for all of us to sort of play by the rules and to raise some ethical standards here. I'm told by our programming team that you can see the full design pledge. It's on our app. If you go to the section on our app that's this particular discussion and go all the way down to the bottom. There is a little tab that says, I think, collateral. And if you punch that, you'll be able to get the whole thing. But it's very valuable, worth reading, and I'm sure John would appreciate any feedback that folks have or suggestions about it. So, Jamie, let me turn to you next. You've taken this idea to heart at Adobe, and you've taken it several steps further and developed an in-house kind of code of conduct for design and ethics. Tell us why you did that and how that process evolved.
Yeah, first off, I love the design pledge, and when John shared it with me, I was super excited to see it at the breadth that it was at. But at Adobe, because my team, we design software, and we design software that creates all kinds of content, and we also design software that is data analytics, so there's big data involved. And when we started introducing the notion of artificial intelligence and machine learning and other ways to sort of enhance the creative process, but also understand what people are doing within our software, I felt it was very important that we started having a more sort of ethical discourse on the design team. We also have a chief privacy officer at Adobe, and she is a huge fan of design. She's a lawyer, and she and I started having a dialogue around how do we collaborate? How does she come and educate my team on things to think about? And so from there, we actually created these, and hopefully you can kind of see them, these design ethics cards. And they're really more of an activity than like a guideline per se, but I'll read one of them. So the activity is identify potential bad actors and how they might use your product for nefarious purposes. And so then the idea is if you're starting a new project or you're forming a new team or you're doing a new feature, you can use that activity. And an example prompt is, so for photo, video, or audio manipulation, might be used to spread misinformation, so to affect consumer perception and behaviors without their knowledge. Unscrupulous marketers might identify and target people with gambling addictions and relapse propensity to receive casino discounts and offers. So basically, the cards are really to put an awareness into the designers' minds that they're, creating software that edits things and makes things, and they should have this in their awareness when they're designing. Because I think awareness is one of the biggest things that we all need.
So Adobe is obviously a big company. How do you spread this conversation through the company, and how broadly has it engaged people?
So for this set of cards, they were introduced. We do an internal design summit every other year. Oh. And so that's for my team, which is about a little over 300, but we invited 250 engineers, product managers, and just other people from around the company. And we use that conference not only to sort of come together as a design team, but to educate key people within the company about design. And so we had two of the folks on my team, they did a presentation on ethics and design, and these cards were sort of the accompanying piece to that. So we gave them to all of the designers, and then we gave them to our research scientists and a number of other people across the company.
It's really interesting. I mean, do you have a sense of how many other companies have tried to do something similar? Are you unusual in thinking this way about the ethical questions?
I don't think we're unusual. Actually, in the formulation of these cards, we looked at what a bunch of other design teams were doing out there in the world. Yeah, I think Airbnb has something up on their website that we used as a reference. So there's lots of.
It's really, in my conversation with Tim Brown yesterday, I mentioned this book, Against Empathy by Paul Bloom.
Yeah.
It's really thought-provoking. One of the things that Bloom points out is that we talk a lot about empathy and how that's the heart and soul of what the power of design is. And empathy is an extraordinary power. There are superheroes who are empaths. But Bloom notes that the ability to understand someone else, to read their emotions, creates also a power to manipulate them. And that empathy is actually one of the characteristics of a psychopath, right? So, how do you keep from using going from being an empath, which we think is a good thing, to being a psychopath, which is a bad thing, I think is a good question. But I've been doing a lot of reading about this, and it's also clear that there's a lot of pushback in the online and some of the writings about this. People say, who are designers to think that they alone know what's right? How do you respond to that?
Well, I actually was, when you first started talking about it, I was thinking of Margaret Stewart's quadrants, of the two axes that she showed. And it's, one interpretation of that is just to see that we're on a spectrum in kind of both directions. But the other one is it's kind of a slippery slope, that things can go either way or kind of be easily manipulated. And it's really a matter of kind of going back to how to remedy these problems when they do arise. I think that maybe you can predict some things through the kind of role playing and other exercises that you just pointed out. But some of this stuff is also just like responding in real time to challenges.
Yeah, and I think, being able to respond in real time and having the value of the company or the value of the team who's creating the product and putting something out in the world, to know that we don't know everything and to know that we may have to pull something back and that should be okay.
This question of, who are designers to say what's good, what's bad, is a really complicated one, it strikes me. And often the way that it's articulated by people who sort of resent the notion that designers should take it upon themselves to impose their moral judgment on the universe is an argument that connects to our debate about inclusive design, which is to say, so many of the people that are in tech and working on design come from similar backgrounds. Everybody in Silicon Valley thinks that what they value is what people sitting in a rural village in India might value, or in a Chinese metropolis or something like that might value. How do they know that? What's the answer to that conundrum?
Well, I think Kate Aronowitz did a really good job of complicating that, kind of more simplistic view. But the other one that is actually the first line of our designer's pledge, that's a kind of an ode to Tim Brown's message, is like, start with questions. Start with asking questions that lead you directly to the user, as opposed to feeling like you have these, the answers that you're going to kind of bring in and impose. Even if they've been successful in other settings, it's a matter of like always starting with that beginner's mindset, kind of a clean slate, but still honoring your expertise, and yet leaving room for the kind of culturally appropriate or place-specific solutions that again, may have some kind of model in another context, but need to be adapted wherever they're applied.
Yeah.
And I think it's also getting out of your, four walls, or getting out of Silicon Valley and traveling and really seeing how, visiting rural areas of the United States or going to other countries and seeing how people are responding and acting, and just being aware of the breadth of social situations across the globe, I think really helps with that as well.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if you were to think of sort of a top 10 or even a top 5 list of ways that the ability to understand what a user wants gets misused or abused, I'm just curious to hear what would be on your list. I mean, my list might be the kind of surveillance capitalism argument that we're suddenly very, very good, especially when design and tech gets married with what we know about behavioral economics and the whole nudge school of thought. We're suddenly very, very good at using AI and the internet to persuade people to do things, whether it's click an ad, whether it's to buy something that they don't need, whether it's, it's a bit, a couple of people have raised the analogy of gambling. If you can stoke that addiction and make money off that addiction, it's a very powerful temptation to, all right, let's figure out how to game this. Let's put people in a room that doesn't have any lights so that they don't know whether it's night or day, and it'll get them to stay there longer. All these little tricks that we can pull. But so other than getting people to surrender their personal data more than they need to, addictive compulsion to screens, buy stuff they don't need, what else is on that list of evils?
Of evil things. I think one of the things I think, what am I trying to say? Being, not truthful, like false news is another one.
Yeah.
Leading people down a path of something that's complete misinformation. I think that's one of the ones. I don't think you had that.
But what if it's something that your users want, right? And they like it, and whether it's, that you step back and you say, this is probably actually not good for them. If you use that wonderful kind of Eames Venn diagram, maybe this is something that, even though it might be what an individual wants, is outside what's good for society. How do you wrestle with that?
For me personally, I always go back to my values and how I would want to be treated and what I feel is sort of right and just. And if I'm being asked to design something or do something that's going to move the business forward, but it could potentially hurt someone, even though the user might want that, like it's a video game and they want to keep playing the video game for hours and hours and hours, like my son does. If it goes against my value system, I'm going to say no. Oh. So I think it really goes back to us as designers. What do we choose? Where do we choose to put our time? Or even just us as humans, where do we choose to put our time?
I'm going to try to open this up a little bit, but we've invited a couple of conversation starters here to also weigh in, and I don't know if I see where they are. And I'm going to kind of come among down onto the floor here and try to get feedback and questions from the audience. But Sean Carney, where are you? They're right there in front of me. Okay. Tell us a little bit about sort of your experience at Philips in trying to wrestle with some of these ethical design considerations.
Yeah, so I can really relate to what you were talking about there earlier. We, as designers, sort of got a seat at the top table. We've been trying to do this for years and years, and now we're finally there. And we have a responsibility to the business, but we shouldn't lose sight of kind of our training, our background, and exactly what you're talking about with Design Vanguard. So as an example, we were asked by our ultrasound business to go into the Indonesian market because there was a huge opportunity there. Women and babies were dying for very avoidable reasons. And what they needed in the mind of our ultrasound business was their latest state-of-the-art OBGYN midwifery kit, and they could go in there and they could sort all of these problems out. Now, these are big $250,000 plus pieces of equipment. So we said, well, before we do that, let's go in context, go in the market, go do some ethnographic research and go find out what users are actually doing there and what the opportunity is. And of course, we came back with an answer the business didn't like. And that was, there's no power, there's no skilled labor, people wouldn't know how to use this. So if we really want to have an impact on society, save babies, then we're going to have to come with a different solution here. So what we did was then hack together a solution using a small mini transponder, the bit that you put on the belly, hack that into a simple Android device, and then hosted an application in the cloud where we could bring that ultra-mobile ultrasound into the field and give access to semi-skilled, semi-trained workers. And guess what? They were able to fix a lot of these problems by doing that. Now, that wasn't a very popular answer because we just created a product and a solution, but we didn't have a business to adopt that. But we had to then quickly spin up a business, and now we're actually selling that product in North America, in Western Europe as well. But it does require that you stick to your principles as design and speak up, even if it's not popular with the business as well.
So that's one that I guess in the long run has a happy ending because it turns out to be a commercial win as well as the right thing to do for the user. I think the complicated case is, what if you have a device that actually there is power for, you can sell, and you realize you can sell this $250,000 machine, but what the user actually needs is something that's maybe only $25, And what do your sales guys say when you go back to them and offer them that alternative?
Well, even now we've got access to data. So even in North America, we're going in and we're designing, let's say, a radiology department.
Yeah.
And through the data, we can look at usage and flow patterns and behaviors. And we could determine what is the right number of devices they need to satisfy their needs, which may be one less than our sales guy was hoping to sell to them.
Yeah. Interesting. Jenny Arden, here you are. Okay. Airbnb, one of the signatories to this design pledge. Can we get a mic to Jenny? Share with us your experience about some of these dilemmas.
Yeah, so not focusing actually on Airbnb,
Yeah.
I wanted to tell a quick story that happened 11 years ago and one that happened 3 hours ago. So 11 years ago, I was in New York City working financial services on behalf of agencies. I had a boutique agency that I was running, and I was contracted to do a lot of work for very large banks. But at this time, I was working on a project that was for, I'll say, an unnamed automotive company that's fairly well known. And the product was selling loans to consumers that needed loans. They needed to buy a car to get to work, so they were targeting low-income people with loans that were clearly not within their means, meaning 20 to 30% APR. And at the time, and in the design world, we were told to do your job. We were told that this was what the client needed, this was what the RFP was all about. And design, when we didn't have a seat at the table, we couldn't push back. We couldn't say no. And what I'm really proud of right now is that we are in a position to say no. We are the keeper. We are the goalkeeper of that sort of, I don't want to say moral beacon, because I think that implies ivory tower, but we are the ones that are able to ask the questions in order to make sure that we're doing something that's good for humans. And then the thing that happened to me 3 hours ago that I want to say, like, this is really, really connected. I got this email from a very small app. And I'm going to read you the email real quick. The title says, "Last chance to save your account." The content says, "If you miss this, there's no going back." And then there's login button. And it says, "We'll delete your account and its content in 1 week. This is your final chance to keep them." Now, anyone want to guess what this app actually did? This was an app I used with my family to take pictures of my children. And to gather that, we pulled it together. It's basically an app for all of my family members to post pictures of my children in a private setting. And they're threatening to delete all of my content. What I'm trying to say is the connection between these two is that the little drops, these little tiny toxic drops, creates an ocean. And it creates major, major problems for society. And so back then in financial services, what that product was doing is actually creating a financial crisis collectively. And what these little emails are doing is actually creating a sense of urgency that's not actually there and creating cognitive load. And I think this is the responsibility for designers.
Wow, that is such a great comment, because it ties together another of the concepts that we've been talking about here, which is what happens when you have the power of empathy and you multiply that by scale. Empathy at scale can be great, but when everybody's doing stuff that's slightly shady, it may be okay in an individual case, but it has these aggregate effects that are often very difficult to predict and can be terrible for the system as a whole. And so I think being able to have this larger debate about ethics guidelines, right, makes it easier for everybody to identify the systemic risks and what to avoid. All right, so I want to invite participation and comment questions from everybody here. We've got a few minutes to discuss this. Does anybody else have an example to share of where issues of design ethics came up? Andrew, I see you in the side over there.
I don't have an example as such, but I thought the design pledge was great. There were a few notable companies that one might expect should be on them. I'm talking about the big tech social media businesses. So I guess I have two questions. One is, are they being approached? Are they going to be joining this pledge? And the second question is really, to what extent can the business design community be expected to safeguard and police itself, or do we expect outside forces like government agencies to come in and play more of an arbitrator?
Great question, John. I mean, what can be done to I mean, do we shame companies into having to be on this list? Do we, I mean, what are the remedies?
So we looked at an array of other pledges over the years. Dieter Rams has the Principles of Good Design.
Yeah.
There's other manifesto type documents, and we definitely gravitated toward one that don't take shaming or kind of beating people over the heads with certain things. You take one example of basically investing in equity is one of the pledges, and you could take that two different ways. One is you could say that designers will not contribute to the accumulation of wealth.
No.
On the other hand, you could say that designers will invest charitably and philanthropically in design as a force for social change. And so we were trying to do something that was positive and additive as opposed to something that relied on shaming. In terms of like the policing and regulation, that's a harder thing. Design Vanguard, truthfully, has all these like big companies, but it's still a completely grassroots effort.
Yeah.
Maybe it'll evolve into something greater. I mean, there was a much bigger appetite than we anticipated. We put out a call, and people responded, pretty instantly. And so we see a great appetite. There are definitely other companies that can and should be on that list. We're simply dealing with a capacity standpoint, a capacity issue at this point. But I think there's a great future in this line of thinking.
Anybody else? I'm curious, how many people here have companies that have like ethical codes of conduct that apply in some way to design? Well, that's pretty good. And how many people here think that this is not really a debate for designers? This should be a CEO function, and it should be worked out with CEO and shareholders? No one. No one wants to take the counter argument on this? Oh, here, all right. Okay, can we get a mic? Shoot us.
I'm Janice Feldman, and I'm the owner of Janice AC. And I'm concerned that a lot of the big companies are eclipsing honest content. That's what I'm most concerned with. And I think it is a difficult decision for designers to know when they should or they shouldn't or they can or they can't speak to something on the messaging of the companies that they work for or they're affiliated with. That's what I'm really concerned with. And who's the arbiter of what's the truth?
Yeah.
Now, that's.
So you're uncomfortable with someone saying just because they have a design background or a design function that they have some kind of moral superiority over other executives or even the CEO or owner of a company?
I'm sorry, I don't hear very well. Say it again, please.
So I'm just trying to understand your concern with that. I mean, is it that you think that there's no way to decide what's right or wrong, or is it that you don't think that designers should be the one to be making those choices?
It's a tough call. I mean, I'm a designer.
Yeah?
So it's very, who's the one to say that it's right or wrong? And I think designers with this content are being put in a very tough position to say who is the moralist here?
Right.
Who is the one with the choice? The example the lady gave about the photographs being eliminated and threatening her that if she didn't do this,
Right.
I mean, that's an abuse by the company that sold her the app in the first place or lured her to use the app. And, that's troublesome.
Right.
So in a bigger picture, I'm concerned with some of the very large companies that are putting information out there that are, abusing and misguiding all of us to what is the truth in content. And who's the one who's going to decide?
Who's going to decide?
Scary.
So you raised several really interesting questions there. I mean, one of which is that if designers kind of take the bait in a way, and they step up and they say, we are going to embrace this broader role of being arbiters of what's good and what's wrong and what's right and what society's values are, that they're really sticking their neck out. They're putting themselves in this very risky position of being not just designers, but actual judges, moral arbiters. Should they not be taking on that role, John? What do you think? Is that something that they should say, look, that's above my pay grade, that's the CEO's job?
Well, I think there was a similar debate when we saw several companies introduce chief ethics officers.
Yeah.
They were basically asking, like, why isolate that to a single person?
Right.
And, even when folks talk about having a chief design officer, the kind of the preferable thing would be that design is pervasive throughout the company and every decision that they make.
Yeah.
That ethical decisions are not isolated in a single person. I think some of this we could just also look at the way that Tim Brown characterized it, that this may just be a moment in this kind of larger life of ethical implications of design, or just the role of design in business. We're in this moment where we see social media companies in particular under a lot of fire for some of the ethical quandaries that they've both bumped into and created, frankly. And so that's where the tension really lies, I think.
Anybody here have kids who play Fortnite? So I've got a 13-year-old boy, so this is an issue for me. Fortnite is a brilliantly designed product, right? Every tool in the behavioral science toolkit since B.F. Skinner, and the black box, these guys have figured out how to make teenage boys absolutely riveted to that screen. And so, from a design standpoint, I say, wow, well done. But from a parental standpoint, that freaks me out. Any thoughts on what the responsibilities of designers are for those kinds of products? Does anyone? Do you want to take a crack at it, Jamie?
Well, I think that this is such an interesting conversation because, I think we all have a responsibility to the things that are being put out into the world. And Fortnite, my son, I've never played, but my son plays Fortnite, so I've experienced the draw of that game. But then, I have to step in as a parent. And I have to, there's still this human aspect. We can't have, everything is just being driven by technology. Like, we still have to take care of one another. But I think that, the story about the ultrasound for me was great because it's using the power of design to change the mindset of the business. And I think that in companies or in situations where designers do have a footing to do that, even if they fail, they're trying to change the conversation and using design to do that.